Hello, True Crime Nation. Welcome back to Old and Code Crimes. I'm your host, Melissa. Now, just a quick disclaimer, I make every effort to fact check the information I'm giving you, but because these cases are old and the investigations are ongoing, what I say today may be outdated tomorrow. So just keep in mind that if there's any major updates to these investigations, I'll create a new video and get it out to you as soon as possible. So be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so anytime there's an update or a new video, you are immediately notified. And with that, let's look at our next case. Today we're going to look at the case of Janet Raasch. She was a 20-year-old college student who was found murdered in 1984. Well, at least police thought she was murdered based on their initial investigation. Fast forward to October of 2022, and with a reinvestigation of all the evidence, they have now concluded that her death was not murder, but an accident. Janet Raasch was born on July 24th of 1964 in Merrill, Wisconsin. Now, Merrill is a small town of about 9,000 people, and it's about 100 miles northwest of Green Bay. She was the youngest of 3 daughters. Her older sisters were Nancy and Bonnie, and she grew up on a small farm. Now, the girls tended to the farm, baling hay, cutting grass, whatever it took to make sure that the farm was running smoothly. But when they weren't working, they were playing outdoors, and they especially loved to go fishing. After graduating from high school, Janet went on to University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point to study business, and it was about 50 miles from her hometown. In October of 1984, Janet had planned to visit her dad the weekend of October the 11th. Well, she never showed up. Her father filed a missing persons report on October the 15th, and the investigation ensued. Janet was last seen on the morning of October the 11th, 1984, on campus where she lived at 312 Watson Hall. After she was reported missing, an acquaintance told police that they picked her up while she was hitchhiking on October the 11th. They said they dropped her off at the intersection of Highway 54 and the Double J in the town of Buena Vista. University of Wisconsin officials confirmed that she had left campus because she had made arrangements for someone else to work for her at the depot where she was scheduled to work that day. Several witnesses also confirmed to police that she was seen several times throughout the day where the acquaintance said that they dropped her off, which was near the intersection of Highway 54 and Country Road J South in Buena Vista. On November 17, 1984, Janet's remains were discovered by 2 deer hunters in Buena Vista. The area was sparsely wooded and about 300 feet off the road near the intersection of Highway 54 and J, about 15 miles south of Stevens Point. The police were called and they got to the scene right before 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and the family was notified that Janet's remains had been found about 5 o'clock that evening. Based on what they saw at the scene, police immediately treated her death as a homicide. Now, her remains were sent to the medical examiner for an autopsy, but due to the state of decomposition, because we're talking 37 days later, they were not able to give an exact cause of death. However, with additional testing, strangulation was listed as the probable cause. Now, over the course of the years, there was a point in time that the police thought they had a suspect, but there wasn't enough evidence to arrest or convict. In 2002, 18 years after the murder, police received a tip. They got the family's permission to exhume her body and investigate. And there was a little bit of advancement with DNA technology, not what we have now, but more than they had in 1984, so they did additional DNA testing to see if the perpetrator had left any evidence behind. But the exhumation and investigation rendered no new evidence, leads, or suspects. In 2013, almost 30 years after her murder, police received an anonymous letter, and it contained details that were not made public. Police tried to track down who wrote the letter, but they were never found. Now let's fast forward to October the 11th of 2022. So October the 11th of 2022 is the 38th anniversary of her disappearance. Now, she wasn't reported missing till October the 15th, but she was last seen on October the 11th. And Portage County Sheriff Mike Lucas and Detective Dustin Kitzman held a press conference regarding Janet's case. So even though the case was cold, they never stopped working it, and Detective Kitzman started working the case in May of 2020. He read through thousands of reports and evidence, and he did make it a point to give credit and praise to the previous investigators because they had done an excellent job of preserving the evidence for almost 40 years. So it was still usable, and it was awesome, and it actually helped crack the case. So in 2022, and even going here into 2023, there are a lot of new technologies out there for crime scene investigation. They use 3D modeling, forensic research, evidence by analysis, expert medical, fire, investigative analysis, and there were several agencies involved, including the Wisconsin Division of Criminal Investigations. Now let's comb through the details of the evidence Detective Kitzman used during the press conference on October the 11th of 2022 that determined that her death was not murder, but was in fact an accidental burning. And please let me know what you think in the comments as we go through these details. Through 3D rendering of scene measurements, diagrams, and photos taken prior to the investigation, it was determined that her body was located 100 yards from the roadway. A perimeter search was conducted, and her belongings were located an additional 50 yards to the southwest of her body. Janet's duffel bag was in the center with items scattered around it. Different fiber materials were discovered to the northeast, which were later determined to be pieces of her sleeping bag. They said her belongings were significantly damaged by fire and exposed to the elements for 37 days before her body was found. These items included a radio, a flashlight, and other travel items. Her sleeping bag was laid out and pieces of it were strung out across the scene. Several zippers were found northwest of her belongings. Now this is pretty important here. The zippers, zipper teeth, and sleeping bag were all analyzed. Despite the fire and exposure to the elements, investigators were able to identify one of the zippers as being from the sleeping bag, and they noticed its teeth were fully intact. Fibers from the zipper teeth matched fibers from the sleeping bag, which was made of cotton and polyester. This indicated that the sleeping bag was most likely closed when it caught on fire. So she's inside of her sleeping bag, and the sleeping bag catches on fire, and so far what we're seeing at this scene is she is trying to get it off of her. So next they bring in fire experts to help identify the rest of her belongings, because everything is burnt so badly you can't just tell by looking. Some of her items were hush puppy shoes, which was the type of shoes that she was known to wear, her undergarments like socks and bras and underwear. There were other burnt debris found between 8 and 17 feet from her belongings. Now these included her keys, a keychain with her name on it. There were several coins in her jean pockets. They found her jean rivets. They found a shirt belonging to her. Now investigators found leaves underneath these items that were burnt, and this led them to believe that the items that fell on the ground were hot and on fire, causing the leaves underneath them to catch fire and burn. They found a piece of jeans about 10 feet away from her belongings, and the teeth were still intact. This told investigators that the jeans most likely caught fire while they were zipped. So now we have another horrifying picture that her sleeping bag's on fire, her jeans are on fire, and she's desperately running around trying to get this stuff off of her that is burning her. So Janet's remains were found south of this debris field, about 50 yards towards Highway 54. The original autopsy and other evidence was reviewed by University of Wisconsin Health's forensic pathologist Dr. Robert Corliss and medical examiner Scott Rifleman. And through reviewing and analyzing the evidence they had, old and new, they determined that she had suffered third-degree burns to approximately 50 to 60% of her body. And the medical experts determined these thermal injuries, coupled with the environmental factors, would be lethal. So there were several items that were found on Janet's remains, including her watch, ring, and her necklace. Now the necklace around her neck was intact and unburned, which was consistent with the fact that she did not have any burn injuries to her head or her neck. The button they found from her jeans showed that there was fabric on the other side, indicating that they were buttoned when they were set on fire. There was a blue sweater which Janet was last known to be wearing laid over towards her umbrella, and the way that it was laid made investigators believe it was put there and used as a pillow. While investigators were examining her jeans pockets where the coins were, they found another type of fabric on the outside. There were several areas that looked like melted plastic or polyester on the top left and bottom right, and the melted pattern on the jean pocket matched what the material was and the pattern was on her sleeping bag. Another piece of jean material was found 8 feet from her belongings. It also had material melted to the outside, which matched her sleeping bag. The same thing with the puff sleeve of her shirt. Materials of her sleeping bag was found on the outside. They found open soda cans, radios, and other things still intact at the scene. So here's where they tie another piece of this together. Janet was last seen carrying a duffel bag with a sleeping bag tied and attached to the top. Investigators go on to explain that if the sleeping bag was tied up and set fire, it would not unravel itself. Somebody had to unravel it and lay it out, and it was intentional, and they believe it was Janet. Since her sweater was laid out over the duffel bag oriented with the umbrella as a pillow, they determined that her jeans were buttoned, they were zipped, and her shirt was tucked in, so she was fully dressed. And that is why the sleeping bag material melted onto the outside of her jeans when she was on fire. So with the re-examination of old evidence and reintroduction of new evidence using current methodologies and technologies, and with the assistance of several agencies and investigative experts, Detective Kitzman and his team determined Janet was asleep in her sleeping bag when she awoke engulfed in flames. She attempted to get away from the fire, and as she moved around, pieces of the sleeping bag and everything were deposited near her belongings. She continued south where a large amount of the material from her jeans and sleeping bag continued to spread until she was about 17 feet to the south of her belongings, where additional jean pockets, coins, and keys were deposited. At this point, she is minimally clothed and severely burned, and she is trying her best to get to Highway 54 so that a passing car will see her and help her. But she is already burnt too severely, and she collapses and she succumbs to her injuries. And with that, Detective Kitzman announces that her death has been changed from homicide to accidental, and the case is now considered closed. So this is heart-wrenching. I couldn't imagine being in a sleeping bag, on fire, trying to get it off of me, and it's melting to me, and all I can see is a highway wanting to get to it and wanting someone to help me. And I'm sure that's heart-wrenching for the family too. I mean, no way to lose anyone is a good way to lose anyone. Either way, the family is lost. They have some closure. They know what happened. But whether it was murder or what happened to Janet, it was a horrific death, and hopefully they can have some peace and some closure. And that concludes today's case. Please like, share, subscribe, and get notified so you know immediately when there's a new case or an update. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Until then, take care out there.